An additional factor to consider is that assimilation and acculturation efforts are the result in the U.S. after having different peoples gain a footing in terms of demanding equity or equality. When you can't keep people separated racially, as was the initial intent, to keep enslaved people in a certain caste level and to keep Native American people separated. If you can't have separation, complete segregation, then the next logical thing is to work on assimilation, getting the minoritized, the racialized to assimilate. Take a look at Senator Calhoun's speech after the U.S. won the war against Mexico and was annexing land. Senator Calhoun made a long speech. He said, "We have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. To incorporate Mexico would be the very first instance of the kind of incorporating an Indian race. For more than half the Mexicans are Indians, and the other is composed chiefly of mixed tribes. I protest against such a union as that. Ours, sir, is the government of a white race. The great misfortunes of Spanish America are to be traced to the fatal error of placing these colored races on an equality with the white race." And this is just an excerpt of his speech, but he was making a case for not annexing too much land, too much territory from Mexico in what is now the U.S. Southwest. He actually advocated for annexing a smaller bit of land because he did not want to create an imbalance where there would be too many Indian or mixed tribes, as he called them, mestizos. As you know, Mexicans are of mixed ancestry, Spanish, indigenous, some African, some Asian, primarily Native and Spanish. So this set in motion a certain ideology. Years later, we have people attempting to earn citizenship. So let's consider assimilation, citizenship, and white supremacy and these relationships. In 1914, Ozawa filed for citizenship. He argued that race was a matter of color and culture and, quote, claimed his skin was whiter than that of the average Italian, Spaniard, or Portuguese, and that he was thoroughly assimilated and a fervently patriotic American, and that he had raised assimilated children with no ties to Japan. He was basically using the same line of reasoning that pandered to white supremacists and assimilationists. My children don't speak our ethnic language. We are fully assimilated. My skin tone is light. I'm as light or lighter than some Europeans. However, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected Ozawa's arguments in 1922 to become a naturalized citizen and, quote, relied on scientific opinion that denied skin color as a criterion of racial classification and held that white was synonymous with Caucasian, end quote. The court stated that Japanese immigrants were not white since they were not considered a Caucasian race. So here we have the Supreme Court saying that white, that skin color, is not a criterion of race classification, when in the 1700s, that was exactly the criterion used for race classification. So this is another example of how governments, how societies at the structural level have constructed what a race is. So here, because a person of Japanese ancestry wanted American citizenship, they said, no, you can't have citizenship because even though your skin is very white, what it means to be white means that you are Caucasian from the Caucasus region. This, of course, I remind you, is during the time period of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So 1914 was when he sought American citizenship and was denied. Thind. Thind was a naturalized citizen who first entered the United States in 1913. After the Ozawa case, Asian citizenship was revoked. Thind pointed out that science had classified South Asians as Caucasians. He claimed that he was a descendant of the Aryans of India and belonged to the Caucasian race and was thus white within the strictures of U.S. law. The Supreme Court denied his argument. Thind, along with other South Asians who had been naturalized citizens, were all denaturalized, and without citizenship status, South Asians were subject to California alien land laws. So they lost land and could have been deported, but they became people without a nationality, because if they had been here long enough and had denounced nationality elsewhere, they were basically people who were unclaimed, didn't have a home. Vaishno was subjected to California's alien land laws. He was forced to liquidate his property, including his general store. In 1928, the government refused to grant Vaishno a U.S. passport to visit family and relatives in India. They wouldn't give him a passport, and so he couldn't go to India because he wouldn't be allowed to return. He drove to San Jose, rented a hotel room, and took his life, unfortunately. And there were several suicides, all because citizenship was revoked for Asian Americans. There's the Roberto Alvarez versus the Board of Trustees at the Lemon Grove School District. Interestingly, there was it's known as the Lemon Grove incident, where children went to school and were denied entrance to the school. California was trying to establish a segregated classroom. It was more like a barn for these students, and the families went to the court and tried to sue. And they said Mexicans are technically white in the 1920 census, and this took place in 1928. So if they are considered white, how can you try to segregate them? Well, immediately after that decision, lo and behold, 2 years later in the 1930 section, for the first time, Mexican became a category on the census. So you see these structural moves at the political level, at the highest political levels, working to separate, segregate, find ways to either keep people segregated, to not allow them citizenship, or worst case scenario, if they are, then the goal becomes to assimilate them. Which takes us to the Venugopal article, The Truth Behind Indian American Exceptionalism. You can take a moment to pause this video and review that essay. But one of the most impactful quotes, I think, is when Venugopal states about his parents and his aunties and uncles. Despite all their success and nearly 50 years of living in the U.S., the uncles were reacting as if their Americanness remained tentative and conditional. The cases of Ozawa in 1922, Thind in 1923, Mexican Americans in California, and other groups all point to the social construction of race and the intention behind these shifting categories. How has white become codified in the U.S.? And how has that shaped our nation's understanding of what it means to be white, to be accepted as white, or a person of color, or, in terms of the Indian nations, to be considered civilized? What then is whiteness? What has whiteness meant? And how has that been synonymous with American citizen? Take a moment to think about our students. Students of minoritized ethno-racial communities feel the pressure of assimilation in academic institutions. Some gladly assimilate, some feel conflicted, some reject assimilation, but at what cost? If we're thinking of assimilation versus liberation versus self-determination, privilege, just freedom, opportunity, is there a cost for that? Assimilation's theory's underlying message is that what you have, where you live, the schools you attend, ultimately what makes you you, who you are, is not good enough. A lot of people of color and ethno-racial POCs, we are very skeptical of assimilation, because when people talk of assimilation, it's an invitation. It comes across as an invitation to have better, to be privileged, to climb the ladder. And the underlying message is that where we currently are, racially, heritage-wise, that what we have is not good enough. And I don't mean opportunities. It comes down to identity. Feeling that we are not good enough unless we are in close proximity to whiteness. There is an implicit invitation to assimilate and be rewarded. What are your thoughts on this? I look forward to discussing more with you. But consider your awareness of people's racial identities, your knowledge of what they have experienced, are feeling, or have been up against as they go further into higher education. Your colleagues, professionals of color, what do you think is the psychological, emotional identity burden for people who want to excel in American institutions? I look forward to having you reflect and be ready to discuss next time we meet. Thank you.